Hey, it's Jackie here from the Early Years Learning Hub. And before we get started, I wanted to let you know about our subscription option. If you're a fan of our podcasts and would like to see us continue to bring you interesting speakers on all of the topics you didn't even know you needed to hear about, as well as accessing some really great resources to help you put some of the ideas from the podcast into practice, then why not subscribe? It is great value at just $2.99 plus GST per month and is automatically debited from your bank account. Simply go to our website, Early Years Learning Hub, and click on the subscribe button. Welcome to another Early Years Learning Hub podcast. My name is Jackie Ward and I'm the founder and managing director of the Early Years Learning Hub. This episode is one of our Unpacking Theory and Research series, where I invite academics, researchers and experts to tell us what the theory, research or contemporary understandings mean for our day-to-day practice and our work as teachers, educators and leaders. This episode is about the Australian Education Research Organisation, or AERO for short, their Early Childhood Learning Trajectory, specifically what they are and how they support teachers and educators to identify and scaffold learning. Today, I'm joined by Rowena Shirtcliff, AERO's Early Childhood Program Director. Rowena, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your professional journey?
Thanks so much for having me, Jackie. It's a really interesting question. It really started for me in high school. Home for me is a small town in rural Queensland. My parents hadn't had the opportunity to go to university, and one day my geography teacher told me he thought I'd be a great teacher, and there was a scholarship available for country kids to go to uni and study education. At that point I hadn't really even considered teaching. I was pretty undecided and not sure what I wanted to do, but I knew clearly that I wanted to do something meaningful, helpful and make a contribution to others. So I guess I ended up getting the scholarship, and one of the requirements of that scholarship was that I would work in rural communities when I graduated. I can remember in my final year of uni getting the call to let me know where my first teaching post was, and after I said, "Oh, thank you so much," and hung up the phone, I had to drive to the survey and buy a big map of Queensland so I could actually find where I was going, all those things, which for a country kid probably shows how big Queensland is and how small my world was also at that time. So I guess I spent the first 10 years, so the early part of my career, as an early years teacher in rural and regional areas. And I think this is really foundational to the work I've done. I'm pretty passionate about education for all and children having the highest quality education experiences. And I believe the early years set up children for success later on. So after that, I was sort of seconded into the department to work on some early childhood programs. And it was there that I really worked out that I enjoyed policy, system reform, program development, and eventually I became the Director of Early Years Learning within the Queensland Department, and in that role I had the opportunity to lead work related to transition to school, the Australian Early Development Census collection in Queensland, and early childhood sort of pedagogy, practice and inclusion, which I really loved. I got the opportunity to work with really clever teachers and educators right across Queensland, and it probably then led me to where I am now. At the end of 2023 I joined AERO. I knew that at that point, good decision making required access to really good evidence, and I wanted to be part of that. So I'm a director here at AERO and have the pleasure and the privilege of looking after early childhood focused research as part of my role.
Wow, that sounds exciting. And I was thinking about what you were talking about there, and I'm going, I thought that name sounded familiar. I'm sure I've sort of crossed paths when I've worked at AERO or the New South Wales Department of Education. We'll have a chat about that later. But yeah, what a diverse career. And also I love the fact that you've got that, rural remote perspective, because I in my former role had the opportunity to work with some really remote schools and early childhood services, and it's just was a slap in the face to make me realise how metrocentric I was, and I didn't even realise it. Wow, that's great. Also, all right, let's get down to just a bit of an overview. I thought we'd start with AERO in case our listeners haven't heard of it before, what its purpose is and its resources. So can you give our listeners a bit of an overview of AERO and its function?
Yeah. As you said, Jackie, AERO stands for the Australian Education Research Organisation, and we're quite unique in that we're Australia's national evidence body, and we connect evidence, policy and practice across both early childhood and schooling. So I guess in a nutshell, what we do is we generate high quality research and insights, and also translate evidence into practical guidance, tools and resources that educators, leaders, policymakers should be able to pick up and use to inform decisions in practice. And today, talking about the early childhood learning trajectories are a pretty good example of that translation work.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think that's kind of why I decided to have this type of episode for a podcast, because I do think some people are a bit fearful of engaging with research because they think it's going to be written in a highfalutin way that we can't understand, which often research papers are. But that's why AERO is great, because you've got lots of ways of translating it, making it a little bit more relatable for the general Joe body. All right, so I think the learning trajectories are probably the jewel in your guys' crown for early childhood. So can you tell us, our listeners, a little bit about them and why, what they are and how they were developed?
Yeah, we know from research that intentional educators are critical for maximising children's opportunities for learning and development. We published a discussion paper about this last year. But what we do also know is that one aspect of being an effective intentional educator is an understanding of how children learn and develop. And that's really where the AERO early childhood learning trajectories come into play. They're designed as an evidence-informed practice resource to help educators better understand how development typically progresses across 5 key domains. So executive functions, social and emotional learning, language and communication, mathematical thinking and physical development. They're designed in a way that show a progression from simpler forms of thinking and behaviour towards more complex forms, but by also recognising that children's development is non-linear. It's not isolated and it's not identical for every child. I guess I heard it explained the other day by one of my colleagues, and I think it's quite a useful way to think about it, is a learning trajectory is a map rather than a checklist or a set pathway. It provides educators and teachers with an evidence-informed picture of how children's knowledge, skills, understandings and capabilities typically develop over time within a particular domain. And what we know is that this in turn helps them understand where a child may be now and what learning and teaching opportunities might support future growth and development. One of the key things around how they were designed, though, is that they were deliberately designed as interconnected domains, because research shows that development in one area often supports growth in another. And they are intended to complement and are aligned to the early years learning framework and other approved learning frameworks. When we set out about developing these, we first published them in 2023. There's a lot of rigour behind their design and the thinking around it. We drew sort of from 3 key sources for this. So one was around international and Australian research literature, so extensive reviews from cognitive science, developmental psychology, neuroscience, educational research and discipline-specific evidence. We also, though, wanted to get expert review on that from leading researchers working in that field, so who are really deeply understood around mathematics, language, executive functioning, social emotional learning, physical development. But I think one of the really key parts, and it probably links back to what you were saying earlier around how important it's usable and meaningful and talks to teachers and educators, is that we also incorporated practitioner consultation. So we had feedback from teachers, educators, leaders, sector support to ensure that trajectories were able to be used meaningful in practice, that they don't work if they just sit on a website. No one knows how to use them and how to unpack them. One of the keys around this is it means that they're not based on a single theory. They draw on decades of research. They synthesize multiple research traditions and bodies of evidence into a practical framework. So I sort of describe them when I'm saying, my elevator pitch is that they provide access to the best available evidence about children's learning and development so that they can use that knowledge to make intentional decisions to support children's learning.
Love that. And a few things there that I thought about of what you said there about, obviously we can trust the validity of this because it's based on such a wide variety of research. But also, too, a key fact that links back to people's, I think, confusion around the assessment and planning cycle, you've got to know where to next. You know, you've got to know where you're going to take the learning, rather than just what I see a lot with assessment and planning cycles is people just provide more and more of the same. If you don't know where that child should be going next, then you're not going to be able to provide, you know, experiences and be intentional about scaffolding their learning. So interesting thoughts there. So I'm going to go on to our next question. So now drilling down into the learning trajectories. So you've talked a little bit more about, you know, them broadly, but what are the domains? What's the developmental progress of skills? How do they support assessments and how do they support planning?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the nail on the head, Jackie, that the most important contribution is that they help bridge the gap between research and practice to support that pedagogical decision making, rather than expecting busy educators and teachers to read hundreds of research papers. It's synthesised into something usable for everyday practice. And really, I think the key around them is that they're really about building educator capability and professional knowledge. So they help us understand how development unfolds, what children may already know, what may be ready, how to scaffold. And they are designed in a way that is accessible for everyone. So each domain is broken into subdomains. So physical development, for example, covers gross motor skills, fine motor skills, sensory awareness, and physical health and self-care. And then within each of those subdomains, there are strands that describe the capabilities that change over time as children learn and develop. And within each strand, then what there are these indicators of what an educator might actually observe as a child progresses along that trajectory. And these indicators sort of build on one another over time. What we've done this year, we've just republished them, got a new look and feel, they're a bit jazzy, but we've updated them to include more detailed information about what we might actually see educators and teachers doing to support development within these domains, and that's quite new for us. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it provides a start point for sort of how a scaffolded approach can support teaching and learning practices, and how we can have that really responsive and effective intentional play-based practice. This then sort of makes them really useful to support assessment and planning more purposeful and meaningful. And I guess one of the ways we sort of see that and link to the planning cycle and that critical reflection, that iterative cycle that we see, and which is tricky in early childhood, because we're asking people to make decisions in action and on the spot and think about that. They've sort of got to have a really good backlog of knowledge around the children as well as the development in that space. But what we see is, rather than just observing what the child is doing, the trajectory helps you to interpret what's going on. So what learning may be developing in that space. It's a prompt then for planning, so what experiences could extend this learning, and then a frame for that reflection. How did the child respond and what might come next in that space there? But they're quite dense. There's a lot within the trajectories. So I always sort of think starting with one area and diving deeply is probably a really nice way to sort of get a handle on it. But they are designed to be quite accessible and broken down in a similar way in each of the domains. So once you become familiar with them, it sort of becomes easier to use them.
And that's a similar kind of a notion with the early years learning framework, key components within the outcomes as well. This is what it looks like when a child does these, you know, this thing, and this is what the educators can do to plan for that kind of learning. So that's good that it maps to that. So can I just confirm with you, so there's physical domain, and what are the other ones? Emotional?
Yeah, so five learning domains in that sort of space there. So we do have the executive functions,
Yep.
social and emotional learning, language and communication, mathematical thinking, and physical development. They're the 5 domains. And what we know is that they are strongly supported by developmental and educational research, and they align really closely to the outcomes and the vision that we see for children's learning in Australia through the Early Years Learning Framework and other approved learning frameworks. So there are really evidence-informed but really practical way of what we see in early childhood and children's development.
100%. And I think too what you were talking about with the idea that, yeah, there might be a lot of information to consume at once, but then once you've got those things in your brain, you will be able to know, like it's a tool that you'll just draw on, isn't it? You know, like it's not like you have to keep coming back to them once you know kind of the stages of development. So that's great. I do think it's great for anyone who's sort of, I guess, not sure if they know and understand how children learn. I'm thinking all the time when I think about the trajectories how much they align with the Australian professional standards for teachers as well. Know and understand how children learn. Scope and sequence, which is not a term we use in early childhood. It's a term used more in the primary and secondary space. But that idea that our learning is meant to be extending and building on what children know. So that's awesome. So the next thing I think the trajectories are really good, and I'll start with this as an example from my practice, is tools to support conversations with families. Because they're great for identifying, you know, where children might be sitting outside of, I guess, typical development. And the story that I was thinking about when I popped this provocation in is that I had a colleague who was explaining how useful she thought the trajectories were in general, but also the fact that it was a great, like a soft entry for a conversation, you know, with a family. Because often those initial conversations when you raise a concern that a child might be outside of typical development can be really tricky. And for her, she felt like the trajectories were a great tool to support that conversation, you know. So I'm noticing little Johnny's doing really, you know, up here at these different, you know, areas, but on this particular trajectory, he's, you know, more sort of down this end, you know. So it was a conversation started to have, you know, for families to get some further, you know, assessment. But I'll hand over to you. Can you talk about how, you know, AERO feels that the trajectories can be used in conversations to support families?
I think, Jackie, that's what you were talking about around that, the shared evidence-informed language for discussing children's development and learning is really important. And exactly like you said before, once educators and teachers feel confident with it and understand it, it's really easy to recognise it and use it in your everyday practice. One of the things that is probably important to keep in mind is that they aren't age-based milestones and haven't been designed to sort of tell educators and teachers exactly where children are and what they should do at a particular point. So it's sort of, they can certainly help provide educators and teachers, educational leaders, inclusion professionals, families, schools even, develop a more common understanding of children's strengths and learning needs. And we have seen that ability even within services for educators to build a shared language of how we talk about learning, how we talk about development and what that looks like. So my only caution would be as well is that if there are concerns with development, that we wouldn't say to rely solely on the early childhood learning trajectories, that you need to seek advice and guidance from appropriate health and early intervention professionals. And that it is, though, a way to start that conversation, exactly like you said. And that's probably one of the most inclusive features of the trajectories too, is that they encourage educators to understand where children are and support their next steps. So it recognises that children's learning pathways are complex, they're individual, they're non-linear, and there's always a next step and a next point around that, and that makes them quite inclusive for all children. They sort of have been also designed in a way to be quite strength-based. They allow children to demonstrate strengths in different domains. They progress at different rates. They show learning in different ways. And sometimes we will see moving forwards and backwards across points in time in different parts of the domains and subdomains. And one of the things I really like about them, I think, is that because they don't prescribe sort of fixed behaviours that all children will demonstrate, they leave space also for educators to recognise that learning may be expressed differently across cultural contexts and family practices. So it sort of provides enough of a tool to start the conversation and get some shared language and understanding, but it's not so prescriptive that sort of locks us into this and disempowers educators from their professional knowledge and practice as well.
Wow, that's amazing. And I love that idea too, that it's, you know, that really repeating that learning is not linear as well, because I think that's the other thing that we can sometimes think. And I just think that you know, that idea of whenever we're empowering educators to understand learning and also to empower them with some professional language. I think that's amazing. The professional shared language is such an important part to, I think, to generally recognising, encouraging, early childhood educators to be recognised as professionals. So that's amazing. All right, so what are some of the resources that AERO have developed to support understanding and using the trajectories? Because I think you've got quite a big suite there, haven't you?
We certainly do have that. What we know is that educators and teachers are doing important work, often in complex settings. So the research and resources needs to be accessible. Many of our team come from the early childhood sector as well and understand that this context really deeply. So we make sure everything is really considered when we translate that research. So feedback from practitioners and experts. And for the trajectories, we actually have quite a wide suite of resources, and all of this is sort of available free on our website. One of the really good introductory ways, or the first ways to access the resources, is through a series of animated explainer videos. They have an introduction to the trajectories, plus one video for each domain, providing a short sort of visual summary. They're really accessible, they're easy to access, they start good conversations. We then have those deep practice guides for each domain, and they tell you clearly what you might see a child doing, as we talked about, where their development is up to, and they give educators a really scaffolded approach to supporting learning and development and next steps. And so as an example, if we look at social and emotional learning, one of the subdomains is self-awareness. One of the threads sort of within that subdomain is a child being able to recognise and understand their emotions and how emotions influence behaviour. And so at the beginning of that, it talks about a child sort of showing emotions spontaneously through their face, voice or body, and increasingly matching these to what is happening around them. And it sort of progresses along that around displaying a wider range of positive and negative emotions, understanding and using words to describe and express them, name them, those sorts of things. But to support that, what we also see in that practice guide is around responding to children's emotional cues and interests, modelling language, actions and expressions. So that these tools have been designed in a way that give educators that shared knowledge and understanding, but also some practical ways to really tune into that and how we can support that. But I think it's really important to note they're not an exhaustive list. I'm sure if we got a group of early childhood teachers and practitioners in the room, they would be able to continue to add to it and change around that. But we just wanted to provide a starting point. And I think for that, often we've got educators and teachers who are less experienced or starting out, and they want some more practical guidance around where to start and what this can look like. And I think that's probably one of the other resources that we have that's quite helpful, is that we have a reflection activity. And I think it's really important in this space to be able to collect real examples from your own practice, revisit them, and then start to build that shared understanding. There's a user guide. There is an evidence-based report that sort of details how they were developed and validated and what that looks like there. So lots of different things to help support their use, but also give educators and teachers confidence in the way that they've been developed and how they can be used effectively.
I love that. That's such a wide variety, and I love this starting with the animated videos, because sometimes that can just whet people's appetite to go further. And all of those are freely available on the websites. We'll put the links to all the things in the show notes so everybody can access those after they've listened to the podcast. So the last one I'd like to finish on is sharing great practice. So can you share some shining examples of how teachers and educators have used the trajectories?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one. We love to hear how the trajectories are being used. And because they're freely available on the website, we often hear it through conferences or through incidental conversations with our colleagues around that. And we know that they're being used in services, with service leaders, leaders supporting services, and training and professional development programs as well. And I think ideally what we want is these trajectories to help teachers and educators strengthen their practice to be more intentional and not use them in isolation. So for me, when I think about the shining examples, it's probably when I see or hear about educators sort of having that aha moment that I hadn't thought about that, or what does that look like when there's sort of a shift in knowledge, a refocusing of learning and practice. And one example that sort of jumped straight to mind for me was recently I presented a workshop about using evidence to improve practice. I talked about some of the recent research we've undertaken investigating intentional teaching alongside the learning trajectories. And in that room, one of the key challenges I heard from educators was that it's really hard to know how to extend children's learning. What might come next? How can I support this? What's the next step? And how do I even recognise the learning sometimes? And we spent some time talking about and working through what the evidence tells us and how we move beyond observation to purposeful action, and how to use the trajectories to support that. And some of the conversation we had was around it. So for example, if we have a child building a tower and we start with we just might observe that might be the sort of the start point. But when we're using the trajectory lens, and we talked about this around, educators can then start to recognise things like mathematical thinking, spatial reasoning, patterning, executive function, so planning, persistence, working memory, social learning. There's often a lot of collaboration, negotiation, and explaining ideas and language development. And so when we start to see this change and this shift in language, and I think that's the stuff that's really exciting, we know that effective practice is sort of linked to foundational beliefs, knowledge and attitudes that educators and teachers bring to their practice, and research tells us this. So when we see, and in this room I was able to see educators sort of connect the evidence about children's development from within their learning trajectories to their own professional knowledge and what they value and they see every day. Also with this research about effective intentional teaching, we can really start to, shift the dial on meaningful collaboration and meaningful practice change. And I think one of the things too in that example was that there were teams together in that room, and so they were sort of building this shared commitment and culture around this evidence, collaboratively building knowledge, unpacking and giving consideration to their role in children's learning, and deeply examining their own practice and sometimes their own beliefs and challenging each other in that space. So I think for me, that is where I think we can have the biggest impact with the trajectories, and where I hear in teachers and educators doing that deep critical reflection and that deep connection and collaboration. And even just in a workshop, seeing that happen was actually really powerful, and seeing them be able to think about where to and what we want to do in that space.
That is such a great point, Rowena, and I hadn't really thought about it now, because one of the things I always say, because it's also a challenging thing for people to understand critical reflection and know what to do, the part that makes it critical is that we are drawing on some evidence, whether it's contemporary understandings, whether it's research, whether it's theory, whatever it is. We're looking at something else to compare our practice or to inform our practice or all those sorts of things. So the trajectories, are crucial for understanding, assessment and planning, but also a great tool for critical reflection and critical reflection conversations. So that is a great way to finish, Rowena, because I do think these are the two things that people do really struggle with. So hopefully we've inspired all of our listeners to get out there and engage with the trajectories. Thank you so much, Rowena. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be here, and to all the teachers and educators working in the sector and doing this work. I think that we've got a really exciting sort of focus around children's outcomes, and we have such a privileged opportunity to lead change around that. I'm also excited about some future research we're doing that sort of is around a program of research around practice and practice change. So later this year we've got some stuff coming out around intentional teaching, and I'm excited to see how that lands and what that looks like, and how it sort of continues to support educators and teachers to be quite deliberate and demonstrate their superpower and what they do every day for supporting children's learning, development and wellbeing.
Well, I look forward to engaging with those resources as well, because intentional teaching is another one that people struggle with, because I think we tend to think of intentional teaching as more like the teaching that happens sort of later down the track in school, whereas intentional teaching is so embedded within play-based learning programs, isn't it? Well, that's exciting. Well, thank you so much, Rowena, for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we'll make sure we pop all the links in the show notes so everyone can access all those great resources. Thanks for your time, Rowena.
Thanks, Jackie.